In 1942, at the height of India's struggle against its colonizers, a leading freedom fighter, Subhash Chandra Bose, called the BBC the Bluff and Bluster Corporation, bringing into question its status as a credible news broadcaster.
On the 3rd of January 1946 at 9 a.m, the last person in British history to be executed was hanged by the neck until dead. He was then buried in an unconsecrated grave. What was his crime? His crime was broadcasting, and the charge was high treason. William Joyce, between September 1939 and July of 1940, was charged with aiding and assisting the enemies of the king by broadcasting to the king's subjects propaganda on behalf of the king's enemies. He was judged to be such a powerful weapon of mass destruction that he was given the punishment reserved for the perpetrators of the most heinous war crimes, concentration camp guards, mass murderers, etc., execution. I'm afraid that I can't help but wonder, what if the BBC were to have similarly weaponized broadcasting to the level of it becoming a WMD, capable of directing the same devastation as William Joyce, but now in every language, to every home, in every country, in every corner of the world? The BBC is capable of manipulating the minds of billions. Like Joyce, it could be capable of making millions of people feel fear, feel hatred, inflict violence, and then potentially disappear without a trace. Could its controllers resist the temptation to use such a weapon? Has the BBC been used in this manner to demoralise, to incite violence, and to destabilise whole societies? If it were to be used in this manner, I shudder to imagine the scale of the harm to global peace that it could inflict.
13 judges, 133 high-ranking civil servants, including diplomats, and 156 senior retired army officers dubbed the recent BBC documentary called India, the Modi Question as delusions of British imperial resurrection. The letter says they would serve journalism better by running a series on the Bengal famine called UK, the Churchill Question.
Just like the establishment of other potent colonial tools, like the British East India Company in 1600, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, too was established under a royal charter issued by the British monarchy on the 1st of January 1927. Its purpose: to control and discipline what was then a poorly understood medium of mass communication. Fondly called the Beeb or Auntie, the BBC has been singularly responsible for shaping and moulding the mindset of the British public, as well as the unwashed masses dominated by Britain across the globe, right from Asia to the Middle East to Africa. The part of the empire that was supremely crucial to Britain, and hence the BBC's plans, has always been the crown jewel of the Raj, India. And why not? After all, from the 1st century to the 17th century, the period before the British arrived on its shores, India's GDP ranged between an incredible 25 to 35% of the world's total GDP, more than all of Europe combined. That is, till the British colonizers came along. An academic research study by renowned economist Utsa Patnaik, published in 2019 by Columbia Press, based on nearly 2 centuries of detailed data on taxes and trade, showed that Britain drained a total of nearly $45 trillion from India during the 173-year period from 1765 to 1938. For all we know, it was India's money that paid for the significant investments in technology and infrastructure that eventually became the BBC. As one delves deeper into historical annals, it becomes clear that beyond just concealing the looting, there was a far more important reason behind Britain's and the BBC's desperate interest in shaping the opinion of India's masses. The British Raj's war campaigns across the globe needed an endless supply of foot soldiers. Nowhere else in the world was there a readily available supply of tough, battle-hardened and disciplined men other than in the martial races of India. India's soldiers, with 800 years of experience of battling and defeating the Mughals and other Islamic invaders, themselves became the empire's own colonial army. Countless cases abound in British military history where an unthinkable victory under the toughest conditions was delivered purely on the back of the bravery displayed by Indian soldiers, fighting under the flag of their own colonial oppressors. Francis Yeats Brown, in his book Martial India, captures the enormous Indian contribution in World War II, writing, "India has 2 million volunteers fighting in the Allied cause. It is the largest, and I think the least publicized, army of volunteers ever gathered under any flag." The significance of this state of affairs was not lost on Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master Nazi propagandist. Goebbels tailored bombastic Nazi radio broadcasts to target the 2 million Indian soldiers in Europe, as well as the next batch of potential recruits in India. The prevailing anti-British sentiment was exploited to the hilt in these broadcasts. Early German victories were inflated and emphasized with an intention to damage the morale of the indispensable Indian volunteers. The carpet-bombing approach of this German radio propaganda was crushing Britain's own propaganda efforts to hold on to their crown jewel of India. It forced a panicked BBC to immediately launch a dedicated broadcast of its own propaganda in both English and Hindustani. Curiously, the specialist they chose to run the Indian propaganda section was none other than a certain George Orwell, later of 1984 fame. This appointment was ironic given that Orwell's book Burmese Days, which was critical of the Raj, had been banned in India by the British government. Despite this, the BBC gave Orwell the task of writing broadcasts targeting Indian audiences. It seems that the policy of message manipulation by a writer of fiction trumped over actual news. Messages and narratives were tailored specifically for different audience groups, and the skill of the wordsmith mattered more than facts or Orwell's personal perspectives. At this time, the British desperately needed to overhaul their image from a global pirate to a generous benefactor of India. You see, by this time, British colonialism had killed over 100 million Indians in nearly 40 years. The statistic sounds unbelievably traumatic even 100 years later. For context, between 1880 and 1920, British colonial policies in India claimed more lives than all the famines in the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea combined. Along with other staffers, the BBC enrolled Orwell onto a special training course meant to teach the finer nuances of the art of radio propaganda. The poet and literary critic William Empson, who was Orwell's coursemate and colleague, described the training course as the liar's school of the BBC. Orwell himself said, "One rapidly becomes propaganda-minded and develops a cunning one did not previously have." One might well ask whether it is safe to conclude that the BBC's standards and operating procedures were heavily influenced by the Nazis. Actually, the reality is slightly more complicated than that. Take Noel Francis Newsom, for instance, arguably the BBC's most controversial war broadcaster ever. As the director of European broadcasts, Newsom led what is still the biggest propaganda operation ever mounted in 25 different languages, broadcasting 24 hours a day across 3 wavelengths. It was Newsom who first implemented the strategy to use news as a weapon of war. For this strategy to be successful, content had to be perceived as not just true, but also recognisably British. Newsom and his deputy, Douglas Ritchie, presided over the famous V for Victory campaign, which was designed and deployed by the BBC to specifically foment a spirit of resistance in occupied Europe. A campaign so successful that even Joseph Goebbels tried to organise his own V campaign to subvert it. It was Newsom who weaponised the news to reinforce the idea of British imperial superiority, whilst at the same time creating the myth of a hallowed BBC. So successful was this strategy that it prompted Joseph Goebbels to warn the Nazis in 1944. There is one way in which the British, despite the narrowness of their political thinking, are ahead of us. They know that news can be a weapon and are experts in its strategy. Years later, the carefully manicured projection of an avuncular anti-Beeb based on culture, music and humour would be skillfully layered over this imperial strategy. But one might argue that all is fair in love and war, and since the world was immersed in the horrors of World War II with the Allies battling an evil nexus of the largest fascist forces ever assembled, should we be holding them to account? To find a definitive answer to this question, let us turn to John Reith, the first Director General of the BBC, and the person largely responsible for forging the institution as we know it today. His comprehensive and unambiguous diary and memoirs reveal much about the foundational principles of independence and impartiality at the BBC. A cabinet meeting, according to Reith's diary, took the view that the government should be able to say that they did not commandeer the BBC, but they know that they can trust us not to be really impartial. In other words, it was seen that there were advantages in retaining at least an appearance of an independent BBC. Just an appearance. A pretense, really. He further said, "The more experience gained, the more it will be realized that here is an instrument of almost incalculable importance in the social and political life of the community." Simply put, the corporation was always a colonizing tool for the masses at home and abroad, albeit with a catchy nickname and a benign-sounding paradigm. On 9th March 1933, Reith recorded in his diary, "I am pretty certain that the Nazis will clean things up and put Germany on the way to being a real power in Europe again. They are being ruthless and most determined." Now, this extraordinary, almost admiring excerpt from the personal diary of the founding director of the BBC suggests that he harboured pro-fascist, pro-Nazi views. A year later, in July 1934, following the Night of the Long Knives, in which the Nazis ruthlessly exterminated their internal dissidents, Reith wrote, "I really admire the way Hitler has cleaned up what looked like an incipient revolt. I really admire the drastic actions taken, which were obviously badly needed." And then 5 years later, after Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Nazis in 1939, he wrote, "Hitler continues his magnificent efficiency." Semantics. One would expect that an institution with almost a century of experience of propaganda would have mastered the use of semantics to achieve its aims. How important are semantics in today's journalism? Enough to demonize a routine judicial process? Or maybe even enough to humanize some monstrous murderous ideology? In a recent BBC Breakfast programme, UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly confronted presenter Sally Nugent, saying, "Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation, I just want to make sure you recognise that in your reporting. These are not militants, these are terrorists." The point to consider is, why did a government minister feel the need to school the BBC on semantics? Maybe it has to do with the BBC's style guide devoted specifically to Israel and the Palestinians. This states that terrorism is a difficult and emotive subject with significant political overtones, and care is required in the use of language that carries value judgments. We should not use the term terrorist without attribution. One could legitimately wonder what further attribution of the undisputedly barbaric attacks committed by Hamas on 7th October in plain sight of the world is still needed to meet the BBC's reporting standards of the term terrorist. For everyone, except the BBC that is, hiding behind sham style guides is sheer hypocrisy, and it is puzzling why the BBC misleads so frequently. It turns out that this habit of casting a colonial overlord gaze on all matters Middle Eastern and South Asian is quite an old malaise. In 2008, the BBC was criticised for referring to the men who carried out the 26/11 Mumbai terrorist attacks, which killed nearly 200 innocent civilians, as gunmen rather than terrorists, the term that is typically used to describe similar attacks in the UK. In protest against the use of the word gunman by the BBC, the famous Indian journalist MJ Akbar refused to take part in the BBC interview after the Mumbai attacks. It turns out that the BBC's imperialist attitude towards India has not escaped the attention of other Western journalists either. Writing for the 2008 edition of the Historical Journal of Film, Radio and Television, Alastair Pinkerton analysed the coverage of India by the BBC from 1947 to 2008. His conclusions are uncompromising. Pinkerton observed a tumultuous history involving allegations of anti-India bias in the BBC's reportage, particularly during the Cold War. He concluded that the BBC's coverage of South Asian geopolitics and economics showed a pervasive and hostile anti-India bias because of its alleged imperialist and neo-colonialist stance.
It seems some sort of psychosis. It seems to have some sort of madness when it comes to Indian Hindus. It's almost as if those in governance at the BBC have set a tone which says, whatever you do, to all the producers of news, make sure that you undermine India. That message comes across loud and clear.
The biggest weapon in the arsenal of the BBC against India has always been its documentaries. These have repeatedly provoked the ire of Indians and elicited bans from the Indian government for being biased, incendiary, and far-fetched enough to the point of being completely fake. Take the case of their recent documentary made on the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which was almost 2 decades in the making. The documentary was a full-on attack on Prime Minister Modi for an alleged role in the 2002 Gujarat riots, in which the BBC appeared to blame him squarely for the harm inflicted. Now, why would the BBC dig up a painful case after 2 decades, given that Prime Minister Modi, who was the Chief Minister of Gujarat at the time, was thoroughly investigated by the highest court in India and found completely innocent? In fact, in its judgment, the Supreme Court of India not only threw out all allegations against the Prime Minister, but also chastised the petitioners for their far-fetched attempt to keep the pot boiling. Does the sensational sting operation, as described by the architects of the BBC documentary, warrant fresh attention? Especially considering that the 2 key interviewees, themselves known rioters, openly bragged about being connected to the top echelons and Prime Minister Modi. Well, the sting video evidence had already been thrown out by the Supreme Court, as these key witnesses had confessed to reading out from a script. It turns out that the BBC's sting reporter wanted spicy material and had asked them to make explosive allegations. From the looks of it, there are ample grounds to conclude that the BBC knowingly executed a media hit job on India and Prime Minister Modi, wasting precious public funds on a propaganda project intentionally targeting a friendly, democratically elected sovereign government, and to what end? Perhaps seeking to instigate regime change or incite insurrection amongst its people. The BBC is no stranger to regular criticism for its peculiarly biased documentaries on India. In 2015, a BBC documentary on Delhi's Nirbhaya rape case called India's Daughter by Leslie Udwin sparked global outrage. Here too, the BBC broke all guidelines under which it was permitted to shoot, including a payment of 40,000 rupees made to a convicted rapist to appear in the documentary. Many believe that this non-credible criminal was likely coached on the script as he stumbled when using words unfamiliar to him, like juvenile for example, language singularly uncharacteristic of an uneducated criminal. Even more appalling was the manner in which the BBC allowed its local partner to sell a horrific crime documentary with a nauseating advertisement stating, "NDTV proudly presents a world premiere interview with a real-life rapist." Did the BBC equate this heinous and gruesome act with some sort of cheap, titillating entertainment? Unsurprisingly, this fact-deficient documentary with its morally questionable style was also banned by the Indian government. Whilst defaming brand India by broadcasting this single case globally, it is noteworthy that the BBC itself was guilty of having a culture where multiple sexual predators were allowed to roam freely whilst abusing children as young as 8 years old. Several investigations have revealed that in the region of 100 children were sexually desecrated by some of the most famous employees of the BBC. More on this willful, blatant and shameful hypocrisy later. It certainly begs the question, how does an organisation with huge public resources and a carefully cultivated public standing repeatedly offend 1 billion plus people with such regularity? Is it by chance? Or could it be by design?
Here's how it works. It's a well-established toolkit. Intellectuals, artists, journalists, authors, editors, and the like from target countries such as India, Russia, Iran, or China are enticed over to the West. There, they're conditioned into becoming supposedly dissident intellectuals who are then weaponized against their home country. Yasha Levine has coined this term, weaponized immigrant, for this sort of pseudo-intellectual immigrant who's then deployed against their homeland. So these types of thinkers and media personalities will often be employed as narrative setters, as editors and journalists, who then play a big role in how news about their homelands is presented to audiences in the West. This also includes a reverse propagandization, as they send Western propaganda back to their homelands with a native face to make it more acceptable. But it's designed to foment dissent and encourage subversive elements in their homelands. So that is essentially the role of many public broadcasters. And that's exactly what the BBC does in India and other post-colonial nations. And this was also standard procedure during the Cold War, when it was perfected by a range of public broadcasters against the countries of the former Soviet bloc, the former Eastern Bloc.
It is undeniable that sometimes BBC's documentaries and reportage has had far-reaching implications for Indians abroad, even on occasion inciting racist physical attacks against them. After the ban of the BBC documentary on the Nirbhaya rape case, a professor in Leipzig University, reflecting the sentiments of many other female professors in Germany, openly confessed in an email to not accepting any male Indian students for internships because of India's alleged rape problem. Yes, the BBC's insidious and false portrayal made matters difficult for Indian students across Europe and almost created a diplomatic fracas between India and Germany. Speaking of flagrant bias, Baron Lord Inderjit Singh of Wimbledon, commander of the British Empire, who had been a famous voice on the BBC's flagship Today programme for over 35 years, said that the BBC blocked him from even discussing a guru from his own religion. Lord Singh was prevented from speaking of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, one of the 10 Sikh gurus who had fought against the violent conversion of Hindus to Islam in 17th century India. Himself a celebrated interfaith activist, Lord Singh hit out at the BBC for its prejudice and intolerance. Despite the episode being based on undisputed historical fact and absent of any criticism of Islam, he was told that the broadcast may have offended Muslims. Despite the BBC loudly proclaiming that we take complaints very seriously, a similar incident of brazen deception caused Rabbi Rubinstein to resign after 30 years of service in the corporation. In this incident, the BBC had claimed without evidence that Islamophobic comments made by Jewish tourists had provoked Muslim violence. Yet, the Metropolitan Police and independent experts who analysed the audio evidence found no anti-Muslim slurs whatsoever. But even that did not deter the BBC's own Executive Complaints Unit from practically exonerating its colleagues, despite all the independent findings to the contrary. Rabbi Rubinstein wrote in an open letter, "I simply don't see how I, or in fact any Jew, who has any pride in that name, can be associated with the corporation anymore." Now, some may argue that these are cases of cautious political correctness stretched to the extreme and not really BBC mischief. Until you discover that the same BBC screened a 10-part podcast entitled "I Am Not a Monster" on the jihadi ISIS bride Shamima Begum. This documentary retraced her journey to Syria and then proceeded to follow this up with a further 90-minute program called The Shamima Begum Story. Perhaps it escaped the BBC's attention that victims of ISIS, as well as families of British servicemen, might have been hurt by the degree of biased contextualization and generous consideration given in these broadcasts to what can only be described as plainly heinous terror crimes. This raises yet another crucial and vexing question about the BBC: the consistent platforming and the kid gloves treatment accorded to Islamist extremists. Here, it is not just Shamima Begum who received red carpet treatment and global exposure. The world was witness to how the national British broadcaster whitewashed the Al-Qaeda and ISIS supporter Majid Freeman as a community activist during its reporting of the attacks against Hindus in Leicester, UK in November 2022. Whilst elevating such anti-Hindu voices, the BBC carefully avoided mention of multiple high-impact Islamist Twitter handles which had actively fueled violence with provably fake anti-Hindu propaganda. In fact, the BBC in one report could not summon up enough courage to call out the Islamists by name, but instead coyly described them as a particular small South Asian community allegedly with conservative views. Yet the same oversensitivity vanished completely when talking about Hindus, where the BBC went out of its way to falsely and comically insinuate that it was they who started the rioting. Against themselves, that is. The BBC's reporting went so far as to repeatedly use the term Hindutva as an anti-Hindu racist dog whistle, when in reality Hindutva is a term that literally means Hindu-ness. In one of its Leicester reports, the BBC talked of analysing 200,000 tweets in English that used certain hashtags about Hindus being under attack and claimed that over 50% of these tweets came from India. They then described this as a manipulation of the hashtags, insinuating that the Hindu support from India somehow worsened the violence in Leicester. Imagine the travesty. The BBC was concerned that the Hindu victims of Leicester were being supported by their own Hindu community, a majority of whom lived in their ancestral Hindu homeland of India. Meanwhile, we still await the BBC's analysis of substantial tweets which originated from Islamic states such as Iran and Pakistan, as disclosed by the independent Network Contagion Research Institute of USA. And if this isn't evidence of the BBC's stark anti-Hindu, pro-Muslim discrimination, then one can legitimately ask, what is?
Especially when it comes to Indian issues or the Indian subcontinent, or when it comes to Hindu issues or Indic issues, meaning Hindus, Sikhs, Jains and Buddhists. When it comes to any of issues like that, They'll say what they want to. You question them and they will have no verifiable evidence, no research, nothing to support their case. Because they've got nothing to support their case, they run away and they hide behind the chart. That's been a consistent pattern.
I stopped paying for my TV license 2.5 years ago precisely because of this. I want the BBC to recognise the responsibility that they have to ensure that their reporting is accurate, it's non-biased, and it doesn't divide communities, which is exactly what they're doing. We need a change and we need it now.
The pro-Muslim, anti-Hindu documentary on Prime Minister Modi spectacularly drew the ire of even Muslim intellectuals. Prime amongst them, Tariq Mansour, Vice-Chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University, who pointed out the BBC could check how many Islamic nations have bestowed their highest honour on Prime Minister Modi. Actually, the feedback that the BBC should frame in its hallowed editorial halls is that from Mansour, who warns the BBC to keep their nefarious agenda away from Muslims. Our community has had enough false godparents who have merely used Muslim issues to build their brands. In a damning piece, Tariq Mansour writes, the phrase white man's burden is well known. It signifies the responsibility forcibly taken on by white aristocratic men to make the world a better place. But equally worrying today is the white media's burden, the self-acquired responsibility of the Western media to create false and illogical discourse around those who are either far from their universe or those they are heavily biased against. The recent BBC series The Modi Question is a perfect example of the white media's burden. It is an unwanted and unsubstantiated commentary on a subject that they are prejudiced against. The mindless targeting of the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy fails several tests.
If one looks at the history of the BBC, especially in the last 35 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the broadcaster has been very fanatical in its support for what's called the Euro-Atlantic agenda, meaning the expansion of NATO for an increased military interventionary role or a role of Western superpowers in the affairs of other countries. So, for example, in the 90s, you had the Yugoslav Civil War and the Kosovo War as the country was breaking up. The British media, led by the BBC, was a big cheerleader for sanctions and military intervention in favor of separatist minority groups, in order to break up a non-aligned socialist federal republic into many smaller states, which could be easily cultivated after the Civil War and turned into Western vassals. And if this had happened in a Western country, the BBC would have been quite critical of it. For example, Spain is a NATO member and a European Union member who has had similar struggles with what they call terrorists and separatists in the Basque Country and Catalonia, which want to break off provinces from Spain to create independent homelands for specific ethno-linguistic groups. Closer to home, the BBC has also been historically hostile to the movement for Scottish independence, as well as the Irish Republican Army and its goal for a reunified Ireland under a single republic, free from British occupation. So have a look and compare how the BBC treats the separatists in the Yugoslav wars, or in India, and the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, with how they treat Scottish separatists, or Catalan separatists, or the Irish Republican Army, and you'll see the dual standard. And while it may be easy to point out supposed Western hypocrisy in this treatment, it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. This is a sign of status within colonial powers and superpowers. If they have the power to apply one set of rules to you and a different set of rules to themselves, it demonstrates that they have power over you. So with great enthusiasm, the BBC and all of its media competitors were very much in favor of Tony Blair and his successors in the UK, engaging in supposedly humanitarian military interventions in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, and others, as well as accelerating color revolutions and regime change in countries that they thought were hostile and needed to be brought closer to the Western fold.
For those that believe the sun has long set on the interventionist British Empire, this small factoid might come as a startling jolt. Recently declassified documents reveal that the UK had planned or executed over 40 attempts to remove foreign governments in 27 countries since the end of World War II. That is, over 40 regime change coups involving British intelligence agencies, covert and overt military interventions, and of course, assassinations. Of these 40-plus coups, probably the most well-known coup staged by British intelligence since 1945 was the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected government in 1953, an operation MI6 planned with the CIA. After years of speculation and suspicion dismissed as conspiracy theories, in a program called Document and subtitled A Very British Coup, BBC Radio 4 finally admitted their connivance in this devious act of regime change for the British establishment. Document reveals the BBC's role in what is now accepted as Britain's catalytic involvement in the coup of 1953, which toppled Iran's democratically elected government and replaced it with the tyranny of the Shah. The program explains, Iran had just nationalized the very oil fields that had powered Britain through 2 world wars. Downing Street wanted them back. London paid Iranian agents to sow seeds of dissent in Tehran. Then, to win American support for a coup, the men from the ministry fanned fears of a Russian invasion. In the early 1950s, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, or British Petroleum as it is now known, was run from London and owned jointly by the British government and private citizens. It controlled Iran's main source of income, oil, and by 1951 had become, according to one British official, in effect an imperium in imperio, or an empire within an empire in Persia. At the time, Iran's democratically elected government, led by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, voted to nationalize oil operations. Mossadegh's government was popular, nationalist, and deemed free from any corruption. The British establishment, however, wanted a dictator who would carry out the necessary administrative and economic reforms and settle the oil question on reasonable terms. The subtext of this meant reversing the nationalization and allowing Britain to continue its plunder of Iranian oil. And for that, they needed help. As one British official noted in August 1952, the Americans would be more likely to work with us if they saw the problem as one of containing communism rather than restoring the position of the AIOC. What was needed was a sustained campaign against the nationalization of oil, the creation of an atmosphere of fear, with fake news to be proliferated to infect the clergy, the intelligentsia, media, academia, and of course the general masses. In effect, what was needed was a BBC hit job. As the programme Document revealed, even the BBC was used to spearhead Britain's propaganda campaign. In fact, Auntie Beeb agreed to broadcast the very code word that was to spark revolution. Revolution in reality meant the coup, so a radio newsreader inserted the word exactly into a midnight time check one summer night in 1953 as "It is now exactly midnight." This was said to be a code word to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, that Britain supported his plans for a coup. The Shah had selected the word and the BBC broadcast it at the request of the British government. Later, in her memoirs, written in exile in 1980, the Shah's twin sister Ashraf Pahlavi, who pressed her brother to assume power in 1953, observed that many influential clergymen formed alliances with representatives of foreign powers, most often the British, and there was in fact a standing joke in Persia that if you picked up a clergyman's beard, you would see the words "Made in England" stamped on the other side. The BBC's role in Iran's and other countries' politics has been so prevalent that many scholars have written meticulously researched books on the subject. Annabel Sreberny and Masume Torfe published a detailed study in 2014 called Persian Service, the BBC and British Interests in Iran, in which they substantiate the perception that the BBC has been not just a neutral chronicler, but in fact an active agent in the politics of Iran and the region at large. Admittedly, BBC Persia's regime change escapades have been the most documented and offer us a detailed template followed by the colonizing forces, hand in glove with the BBC. Perhaps one should examine other coups for telltale signs of the BBC's involvement and compliance. For instance, just like Iran's Mossadegh, the British went after Muammar Gaddafi as soon as he seized power in a military coup in Libya in 1969, nationalizing British oil operations. Unlike Mossadegh though, Gaddafi turned out to be tougher to crack, and it took 4 attempts to finally dislodge him. In 2011, after a major air campaign and with covert support to Islamist militants on the ground, Britain finally succeeded in overthrowing the regime, with Gaddafi being killed in October of that year. It is similarly revealing to examine the BBC's reportage against Saddam Hussein in the lead-up to the Iraq War. A study conducted by Professor Justin Lewis of Cardiff University found that the BBC was in fact the least anti-war in its news reports. Of course, the BBC had good help on hand in the form of the then UK Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, who, according to the Chilcot report, played a key role in making Iraq a target. You see, before the Weapons of Mass Destruction, or WMD's dossier was produced, the threat from Iraq was viewed as less serious than that of other key countries of concern like Iran, Libya, and North Korea. In fact, Tony Blair's government had commissioned an intelligence paper on the WMD threat from rogue states. Jack Straw's reaction, when it came across his desk, was, "Good, but should not Iraq be the first and also have more text? The paper has to show why this is an exceptional threat from Iraq. It does not quite do this yet." So Straw decided that a paper on Iraq should be issued without mentioning other countries of concern. The Chilcot report stated, Straw was advised that the evidence would not convince public opinion that there was an imminent threat from Iraq. Publication was postponed, and the operation began on a dossier which would convince public opinion that military action was necessary. That then is Jack Straw for you. Dubious, unreliable, and entirely questionable. It was this Jack Straw's made-to-believe reports that the BBC used to clothe in credibility its Iraq War drumbeat in 2002. It is the same Jack Straw, with his similarly phony innuendos, that the BBC relied upon to justify its so-called revelatory documentary on Prime Minister Modi 20 years later in 2023. Actually, in the light of its role in the previous regime change operations of Mossadegh, Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, one could legitimately question why the BBC timed its release of a documentary on Prime Minister Modi in 2023. The ill-concealed attempts to link him to 20-year-old riots whilst completely ignoring a Supreme Court ruling that absolved him of any wrongdoing strongly indicate interference in the forthcoming 2024 Indian general elections. The BBC either failed utterly in the most basic of research or willfully ignored the decision of the highest court of a democratic and sovereign nation. One would be hard-pressed to find a more contemptuous, colonial and condescending example of narrative construction. Yet, it would be in keeping with the BBC's broadcasting approach in earlier regime change operations.
We might think that the era of colonialism is over, that just because the British Empire or the British Crown no longer sends a viceroy or governor general to our countries, we're no longer under their thumb. However, their economic systems and political systems of domination have persisted in a phenomenon that's called neocolonization or neocolonialism. These new forms of colonization seek to entrench the interests of colonial powers in their former colonies, turning them into helpless dependencies, while disguising this process as altruisms to audiences both at home and abroad. And this is where the public broadcaster plays a big role in massaging people's minds and manufacturing consent for this arrangement. Developer of the term neocolonialism was the first Prime Minister and President of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who said that the neocolonialism of today represents imperialism in its final and perhaps its most dangerous stage. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. He says, neocolonialism is based upon the principle of breaking up large former united colonial territories into a number of small, non-viable states which are incapable of independent development and must rely on the former imperial power for defense and even internal security. Their economic and financial systems are linked, as in colonial days, with those of the former colonial ruler. So the core goal, in my opinion, of colonialism remains the same: to maintain certain countries as weak, stagnant, and dependent on the powerful hegemon, so that they continue to serve as a source of cheap labor and raw materials, as well as markets for finished goods.
So, is the BBC trying to foment unrest on the streets of India using its various documentaries on riots, communal rhetoric, rapes, and other sustained anti-India messaging? Is the BBC trying to give India and Hinduism a bad name with overtly prejudiced anti-India and anti-Hindu reporting? Is the BBC purposely vilifying India's historic position in the world as the last refuge for persecuted Jews, Parsis, and Tibetans, with reportage characterizing it as an unsafe place for minorities? Why did the BBC's coverage include the false branding of Hindu victims as aggressors in the 2022 Leicester Troubles, whilst at the same time concealing the obvious attempts to ethnically cleanse the city of Hindus? The questions are many, and the answer is loud and clear. India's rise as a global power and its surpassing the UK as the fifth largest economy in the world has not gone down well with the colonialists manning the BBC airwaves. News cycles from India are frequently manipulated by the editorial teams at the BBC and portrayed as flashpoints between Prime Minister Modi and Hindus versus the Western world. A cursory look at the BBC's coverage on India's recent tensions with Canada over its support of the terrorist Khalistani movement, or the successful G20 meet in Delhi, or indeed India's successful groundbreaking moon mission are cases in point. Is it time for British Hindus to consider whether the BBC licence fee funds a regime change operation targeting the democracy of their ancestral homeland?
So it's no surprise that they look for negative stories around these countries. If you go onto the BBC website and you search for India, or you search for Kenya, Tanzania, you'll see that in their news programs, they specifically curate stories that are negative. They're not interested in positive stories because what does that gain for them? There's no feel-good factor if someone else is doing well. It doesn't make the audience feel happy. It doesn't make the government happy. It doesn't further anyone's goals. But if you show how miserable they are, look how sad these poor colonies are after we left. That makes them feel warm inside. It makes their audience feel warm inside through this pornography of poverty, as it's called. But you see, maybe colonialism was good after all. They're doing so badly. We used to take good care of them, and we so nicely, so benevolently bequeathed them the state, and they've made it so bad because they're inherently inferior people who are not capable of governing themselves. So don't you feel better about your sad life in a rainy island that has lost geopolitical relevance during difficult times, 10 years of austerity and economic decline, during botched Brexit negotiations during a very harsh lockdown and COVID measures, where your government is increasingly ineffective or incompetent, then how do you distract people from this cruel reality of what they're living in? They're living in managed decline in a country like the UK. So you create a coping mechanism for the audience that don't complain too much about your lives under stagnant neoliberalism. People have it much worse abroad.
Regime change services provided by the BBC may make sense for criminal colonialists fixated on oil and armament profits, but does it make any sense for the long-suffering British public who has seen a consistent decline in their living standards over the decades? Whichever way you look at it, unquestioning support for the BBC is akin to slaves paying their masters to continue deceiving them about their own enslavement. The BBC has been embroiled in many sexual abuse scandals involving prominent figures associated with the organisation. Noticeable, however, is the stark inconsistency between its charter, which contains high-minded declarations of morality and ethics, and the BBC's actual track record. Let's look at some of the more notorious cases. Perhaps the most infamous case is that of Jimmy Savile, a BBC presenter who was revealed to have sexually abused hundreds of victims, including children, over several decades. His predatory behaviour shocked the public and raised questions about the BBC's culture and practices. It is also notable that the current UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, headed the Crown Prosecution Service when it dropped the case against Savile in 2009. More than a decade later, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson accused Starmer of failing to prosecute the serial abuser Jimmy Savile, who has now died without ever being charged. Is this reminiscent of another dubious Labour Party politician? Let's not forget Jack Straw's role in the non-existent WMDs of Iraq. Another BBC presenter, Stuart Hall, was convicted of sexually abusing numerous girls, some as young as 9 years old, over a period of several decades. His crimes came to light in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal, further tarnishing the reputation of the BBC.
If bias has another name, if deceit has another name, it's BBC. The world has different understandings of them, but BBC means British Broadcasting Corporation. Bunch of colonialists. They catch hold of all the wrong people to manufacture their fake news. They tried a similar feat with Sadhguru, but Sadhguru waved them off like a boss.
சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதி வாங்கலை அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு குற்றச்சாட்டும் வைக்கப்படுது. இதை பற்றி நீங்கள் என்ன நினைக்கிறீங்க?
எவ்வளோ தடவை இதே கேட்குறீங்க?
சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதி வந்து வாங்காம தான்
யார் சொன்னாங்க உங்களுக்கு? இல்லை நீங்கள் இல்லை நீங்கள் நியூஸ் பார்க்குறீங்களா இல்லை கவர்மெண்ட் டிபார்ட்மெண்ட் சொல்கிறது பார்க்குறீங்க?
நான் என்ன கேட்க வரேன் அப்படின்னா சுற்றுச்சூழல் சார்ந்து
இல்லைங்க, நாட்டில் சட்டம் இருக்குதா? இல்லை நாட்டில் சட்டம் இருக்குதா?
இருக்குங்க.
அரசாங்கம் இருக்குதா? அவர் வேலை பண்ணட்டுமே, விட்டுடுங்க அவருக்கு. நீங்கள் எதுக்கு பண்ணுறீங்க? விடுங்க.
ஒரே ஒரு புரியலைங்க. அதாவது வந்து சுற்றுச்சூழல் வந்து இவ்வளோ அக்கறையோடு இருக்கும்போது கட்டுமானங்கள் செய்யறதுக்கு முன்னாடியே வாங்க வேண்டிய சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதியை பின்னாடி எதனால நாட்டில் முன்னாடியே வாங்கியிருக்கலாமே?
நாட்டில் அரசாங்கம் இருக்குதா? சட்டம் இருக்குதா? அவர் வேலை அவர் பண்ணுறோம், நீங்கள் என்ன பண்ணுறீங்க? விடுங்க. என்னஃபா ப்ளீஸ்.
இல்லை ஈஷாவோட இதுலேயே சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதி வாங்காமல் வயலேட் பண்ணிட்டோம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லி அனுமதிக்காக அப்ளை பண்ணியிருக்கு. இதை பற்றி உங்களோட கருத்து
என்ன?
இதை பற்றின உங்களோட கருத்து? இல்லை நான் என்ன கேட்க வரேன் அப்படின்னா இவ்வளோ சுற்றுச்சூழல் அக்கறையோடு இருக்கும்போது முன்கூட்டியே அனுமதி வாங்கியிருக்கலாம்.
Listen to me. Every law that is there in the country has been followed. If there is any discrepancy, we fixed it.
So the colonialists who always wanted India to be a slave have set up their media offices here with one and only one agenda: to fool Indians about the governments, about the businessmen, famous leaders, and destroy the spiritual ethos of Bharat. They build their network with anti-nationals and the media outlets residing in Bharat. And the most important part, who funds them? It's you, by subscribing to it. And number 2, Bill Gates. BBC receives millions from the Gates Foundation. In India, there is a bunch of portals which work in tandem with BBC. They get their inspiration and support from BBC. BBC backs them and features them in the news. For example, The Wire, money laundering accused propaganda from NewsClick, News Laundry, Alt News, and the list goes on. There is bias, there are deceitful tactics, there are preconceived notions, there is prejudgment, and that is BBC. I request the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji and the government of Bharat to consider shut down their factories before they become national security threat.
On the basis of the evidence already presented, is it time to pause and reflect on whether the BBC's tendency to broadcast blatantly hostile content on out-of-favour groups, countries and religions is either ignorance of its own charter standards or incompetence or in fact policy? Is this tendency to peddle hostile content, which has now corroded brand BBC, mere innocent error as BBC executives maintain? Or even more worrisome, are we now finally seeing the real purpose of the BBC, a covert instrument of global war masquerading as a news service? A closer look at the evidence indicates that the BBC's divisive journalism may in fact be its preferred editorial model, with propaganda, truthiness, and deceit being the crucial components in its biased broadcasting value chain. It certainly serves many interests, but evidence indicates that the least of all served are the British licence fee payers, along with citizens in former colonies. Consider these facts. A recent report by the Indian Institute for Mass Communication, entitled Analysis of Global Media Coverage of Events in India, found that Western media's reportage on India over the last few years reflected prejudice, lack of nuance, poor understanding of complexities, hit-and-run reporting, clickbait journalism, and limited fact checks. A far cry from inform, educate, and entertain. Another study by Indian media analyst Amol Parth found that between March 2019 and March 2021, the BBC grew by 173% in India, almost 5 times its average global growth rate. The timeline for this dramatic increase in the BBC's popularity in India remarkably coincided with the Delhi riots in 2020, when its anti-India spin on all news coming out of India reached Himalayan heights. A colonial agent of regime change would seek to diminish national cohesion, religious identity, and economic success in the target country. It would then be natural for BBC content to be a condescending portrayal of all things Indian, a reductionist and biased coverage tainting all aspects of Hinduism, and a tarring of the India growth story with a dark brush of agenda-based narratives. We would see generous servings of poverty porn to counter every economic achievement, a hyping up of any social taboos, and inflated coverage of debunked colonial tropes such as caste, ironically imposed upon India's society by the British colonizers themselves. Naturally, all of this would be broadcast whilst maintaining an impeccable, polite facade of impartiality and objectivity. According to Amol Parth, the words that have predominantly been used by global media houses in the context of India have been negative, divisive, designed to spark outrage, inspired with contempt, with an underlying theme to ridicule India. The report exposed how Western media has different yardsticks for the coverage of similar socio-political developments in India compared to the West. Take for instance Kashmir, an integral part of India and the ancestral home of Kashmir Shaivism, a spiritual tradition of Hindus that is over 5,000 years old. The BBC mischievously refers to this region as an Indian-administered territory.
Indian-administered Kashmir on Thursday.
Contrast this with Scotland or Northern Ireland, which even have their own separatist movements, yet the BBC does not refer to them as UK-administered territories. Could this ever be called fairness in reporting? And if the BBC has chosen institutionalized hatred of certain foreign countries, peoples and cultures as their growth strategy, does it deserve to be propped up by a public license fee? Arguably, a surreptitious tax collected from an unsuspecting audience whose own interests are overlooked and often compromised. This is possibly one of the rare cases in the history of journalism where both domestic and global audiences are forced to pay for their own humiliation and dehumanization. In its recent reporting of the Israel-Hamas war on terrorism, the BBC was quick to accept and propagate fake news from the Hamas terrorists suggesting that a hit on the Al-Shifa hospital had been carried out by Israel. Factual evidence subsequently emerged showing that the missile strike was in fact most likely from the Islamic Brotherhood itself. This prompted MP Alexander Stafford to question the legitimacy of the BBC receiving public funding. He wrote in a tweet,
"If the BBC can't be trusted not to peddle unverified propaganda from a terrorist organisation, perhaps it's time we had a serious look at its charter and funding model. A national broadcaster that acts in such a dangerous and flippant way should not be propped up by the UK taxpayer."
In its reporting of the Rotherham grooming gang crisis, the broadcaster surpassed itself. It appeared to not only completely abandon its mission to inform, educate and entertain, but also disregard its own much publicised BBC standards. Indeed, it was the BBC which described the heinous Rotherham crimes as a child prostitution crisis, shaming the victims rather than blaming the predatory barbarians of a notorious Asian ethnicity who groomed and raped over 1,400 young white girls. It is estimated that over 1 million individual criminal acts of rape have been overlooked. It has been headline news that the BBC consistently used the more general, non-specific term Asian when referring to the overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslim criminal rape gangs. Many have asked whether there is an agenda to protect this particular identity group. In sharp contrast, the label Hindu is used liberally whenever the opportunity to target and demean Hindus arises. Here, then, is clear evidence of institutionalized pro-Muslim anti-Hindu discrimination. Tom Mills, author of the book The BBC Myth of a Public Service, has a grim conclusion to consider. The central problem with the BBC throughout its history has been the extent to which powerful interests have been able to influence its institutional culture and its output. It appears that the BBC is not independent, and evidence increasingly reveals that this is by design. Like all colonizer projects, the existence of the BBC's license fee represents a system in which a population eternally pays for the upkeep of its own chains, pays for concealing injustices and human rights abuses on a breathtaking scale. Historically, elites have thus ensured transgenerational intellectual and emotional enslavement whilst keeping the masses gratefully oblivious to the cause of their own suffering. For those who still insist on a publicly funded BBC, a quote by filmmaker Radha Bharadwaj springs to mind. "When the slave will whip himself after the master has long gone, the work of colonialism is complete." George Orwell, initially employed by the BBC to mould news into narrative, witnessed the outcomes firsthand and reported on his observations, some of them contained in his essay Looking Back on the Spanish Civil War. He writes scathingly about the power of propaganda delivered as news, saying, "For the first time I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie. I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting, and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. And I saw newspapers in London retailing these lies, and eager intellectuals building emotional superstructures over events that had never happened. I saw, in fact, history being written not in terms of what happened, but of what ought to have happened according to various party lines. It is this same strategy deployed by today's BBC which has once again turned its attention to the one that is now finally getting away, the jewel in the crown, Bharat, that is India. As the world recovers from the ravages of European pirates, predators and parasites, the role of the BBC in protecting and perpetuating colonial criminal enterprises is becoming clear. BBC News has nothing positive to offer an indigenous world that is recovering, reconnecting and re-emerging. Indeed, its instinct for fomenting chaos and its colonial expertise in protecting war criminals must be exposed, negated and rendered impotent. This is essential if the cause of global peace is to be advanced. Many across the world believe that the presence of the BBC is a threat to their national peace, security and prosperity.
I, like so many other Brits, stopped using the services of the BBC several years ago, and so I stopped paying this draconian compulsory tax, this licence fee. But I struggle to understand why British citizens still continue to pay this, and especially the ethnic minorities like British Hindus. They are still paying for their own mental manipulation. As for the presence of the BBC in other countries, especially the former colonies, I think it really is time to put the BBC, this agent of chaos and discord, this modern-day Iago, on trial, most especially in Bharat, that was India, the jewel in the crown.
The COP in Dubai.
Let me stop you right there.
We know what the human rights are. You Britishers should not preach us human rights.
Well, hang on a second. You said you've seen more hateful content, but you can't name a single example, not even one.
முன்னாடியே வாங்கி இருக்கலாமே. இல்ல ஈஷாவோட இதுலயே
your nonsense you're saying. Turn off his camera.